This is part one of neoliberalism in historical perspective. Now, throughout the class, I've mentioned that so much of what we identify as Latin American can be found in Mexico. And Mexico is the only country that seems to have almost everything that's Latin American or every kind of Latin American experience, other than the experience of being a small country like El Salvador, where there's this tiny elite. And, you can't find another Latin American country for which that's true. And in so many ways, and we talked about this when we talked about the PRI, democracy is not one of the ways, but in almost every other way, Mexico is in the vanguard in Latin America. So, for example, when we think about the Mexican Revolution, we don't necessarily say, oh, it was so unique. The bigger question is, why did other countries not have a revolution? Why did the liberalism of the 19th century come under attack during the Great Depression and not directly? And I think the answer partly has to do with the intensity of the Mexican experience because of its proximity to the United States. And when we talk about neoliberalism, it's the same thing. So when we look at from the 1980s into the 2000s and this thing called neoliberalism, which we'll define, Mexico is the obvious starting place for a lot of reasons. Now, I hope you've all heard of something called NAFTA, which was the North American Free Trade Act. It was negotiated during the 1980s, and it took effect. It was signed by Canada, the United States, and Mexico, and it went into effect on the 1st of January, 1994. And in terms of Latin America, in terms of Mexico, the argument many people made was that Mexico needed to open to the world economy, needed this sort of free trade, 19th century style liberalism updated, because capitalism was a bit of a failure. And they said, look, capitalism is a failure because the state, through the PRI, is too powerful. And that's led the capitalist class, or the bourgeoisie, very weak. It's meant that for political reasons, the peasantry was never fully integrated into the capitalist economy. It meant that the workers always had an ally in the state, and that made things difficult. It meant that Mexico really didn't have a well-integrated path into the world economy because of the state and protectionism. And neoliberal solutions would change that. So what is neoliberalism? It's a series of domestic and international free market policies to either deepen or develop capitalism. And if we think historically, and if you think through this class, I talk about economic liberalism a lot. And if we think about the 19th century and 19th century liberals, they were trying to establish capitalism by destroying non-capitalist or anti-capitalist institutions. And in Mexico in the 19th century, that was the church and peasant villages. In the late 20th century, it was the state. The idea is the state is an impediment to capitalism. So one of the things that comes out of this, if you think about it for a second, is that this is all about economic liberalism. Political liberalism is not in the equation, and this is very much a Latin American problem that leads to the Mexican Revolution, that leads to populism and all the challenges to populism. Now, people knew this, and what they said was, well, if we have a robust capitalist system, that will lead to democracy. But many critics, and I include myself here, say that actually capitalism needs democracy to function well. In other words, people need non-market means to influence things, whether it's wages or regulation, whatever. They need democracy. And the problem is that NAFTA, the supporters of NAFTA said, well, it'll lead to long-term democracy, but there are aspects of NAFTA that create, special courts that decide things and take power away from municipalities and states and provinces and national governments in Canada, the United States, and Mexico. So NAFTA is, at least in practice, a challenge to democracy. And what people said is, it'll make capitalism so powerful that, democracy will flow from that. And there's, of course, a lot of debate about that. But there was a clear political trajectory to neoliberalism. In the 1980s, we had militaries in much of South America leaving power. And, I think the PRI in Mexico is very analogous to them in that they had been horrible stewards of their economies, that they had domestic and foreign debts. In other words, debts owed to local banks, foreign institutions were tremendously higher than they had been previously. National development projects that had been, part of these nationalist governments building roads and dams, they were very expensive. With the exception of Chile, most of these governments were protectionist. They had big walls around them, and they didn't allow a lot of imports in. And that left these nations with very high rates of inflation. And some of these numbers are very imprecise, but as soon as someone starts talking about inflation between 2,000 and 5,000%, we know it's very, very problematic. But another kind of hidden part of this is that protectionism often led to real shoddy goods. I mean, in Brazil, there was a national television industry, and the televisions were really terrible because they didn't have to compete with a, better made television coming from Japan or South Korea or the United States or somewhere. And it was the poor and middle class who felt the impact of this most. I mean, rich people didn't like inflation, but they had means for dealing with it. They could import and pay very hefty, duties, foreign-made manufactured goods. So things are a bit of a mess, and into this comes Ronald Reagan. Reagan was a very, very aggressive proponent of the free market. He opposed Latin American protectionism, and he was quite ruthless in his policies. I mean, after all, this is a man who launched an illegal war against Nicaragua, a government we technically had diplomatic relations with, the Contra War, because he didn't like them. And so he was not adverse to using power to get his way, and he decided that he was going to use the Latin American debt crisis to force through change. Now, what's the Latin American debt crisis? It's something that takes place and begins in the 70s. It really comes to full fruition in the 80s, and it has a lot to do with oil. In much of Latin America, countries were dependent on oil imports, and when the Middle Eastern countries and Venezuela, through OPEC, decided to increase oil prices in the 70s, they had to take out loans to continue to import oil. Mexico had a different problem. It was an oil exporter, and it was finding more and more oil in the 70s and was spending it. For every $1 billion in oil wealth, they had promised multiple billions of dollars in development projects and other things. So when commodity prices dropped with the world recession in the early 1980s, and when oil prices particularly dropped dramatically, Mexico's then president, Jose Lopez Portillo, announced that Mexico couldn't even pay the interest on its debt, let alone the principal. And this signaled the coming of a broader Latin American debt crisis. Now, what is this debt crisis? This is, countries can't pay their bills, and foreign banks and governments need them to. But as I said, the bankers and the policymakers around the Reagan administration were really quite brilliant and ruthless, and this gave them an opening. They said, we'll help you restructure your debts. We're not going to forgive them, but we'll restructure them, change the interest rate, etc. But we'll only do that if you agree to open your markets to foreign goods and foreign services and foreign capital, right? So imports and, lawyers and finance guys and actual money. And in fact, in 1982, there's a new U.S.-trained economist, technocrat, an Ivy Leaguer, Miguel de la Madrid, becomes president. And he is completely open to this idea. He rejects the old PRI way of doing things. And he says, no, we're going to open our markets to the United States. And he's, of course, followed in the presidency in 1988 by Salinas, Carlos Salinas de Gortari, who we talked about in the PRI lecture as being the guy who won against the much more nationalistic, much more left-wing Cuauhtémoc Cárdenas, the son of Lázaro Cárdenas. He was a Harvard undergraduate and graduate in economics, and he was incredibly in favor of reorienting Mexico towards this sort of neoliberal shift, and he is the one who negotiates and signs NAFTA. And so he is all for abandoning, what is, at that point, over 60 years of PRI policies.